About 1,500 U.S. soldiers are now on standby, not overseas, not at a border, but for a possible deployment inside the United States. And despite the headlines, this is not a confirmed military operation, not a declaration of emergency, and not what many people online are claiming. What's happening in Minnesota right now is far more procedural, far more political, and far more revealing than it first appears. Because behind the words "on standby" is a rarely discussed chain of decisions involving the Pentagon, the White House, state leadership, and a law that hasn't been used in decades that could reshape how federal power is exercised during domestic unrest. And the most important detail isn't the troops themselves. It's why they're being prepared and why they haven't been deployed. The strongest moment in this story doesn't begin with soldiers. It begins with uncertainty. According to multiple media outlets citing unnamed defense officials, the Pentagon has instructed roughly 1,500 active-duty Army personnel to prepare for a possible deployment to Minnesota. These troops reportedly come from the 11th Airborne Division, a unit based in Alaska known for operating in extreme cold weather conditions. But here's the key point that often gets lost. Being placed on standby does not mean deployment is imminent. In fact, defense officials have been unusually explicit about that distinction. One official described the move as taking prudent steps, emphasizing that this is about preparing options, not executing orders. So why prepare at all? To understand that, you have to look at what's unfolding in Minnesota and how quickly multiple layers of government became involved. Over the past several weeks, Minneapolis and nearby areas have seen sustained protests following a series of law enforcement-related incidents connected to federal immigration operations. Publicly available reporting indicates tensions increased after two separate shooting incidents involving federal officers, one of which resulted in a fatality. Those events sparked daily demonstrations, some of them large, many of them peaceful, and all of them occurring in an environment already politically charged. As protests grew, so did the rhetoric. President Donald Trump publicly stated that he was considering invoking the Insurrection Act, a federal law dating back to 1807 that allows a president, under specific circumstances, to deploy military forces domestically to address civil unrest. That single reference immediately raised alarms, headlines, and speculation. But within hours, the message shifted. Speaking to reporters, the president clarified that he did not believe invoking the Insurrection Act was necessary at this time, while still noting that the authority exists if conditions were to change. That nuance matters, because the United States does not need to invoke the Insurrection Act to place troops on standby, and that's where this story becomes less about force and more about leverage. At the same time, federal officials were discussing contingency planning. Minnesota's state leadership took its own action. Governor Tim Walz authorized the mobilization of the Minnesota National Guard, according to the state's Department of Public Safety. Importantly, state officials clarified that the Guard was not being deployed onto city streets in a law enforcement role. Instead, they were staged to support public safety functions, including traffic support, protection of property, and ensuring that peaceful assembly could continue safely. The Minnesota National Guard itself emphasized another detail rarely highlighted in viral clips. Guard members are residents of the state. They live there, they work there, and their stated mission was focused on stability, not confrontation. So now, two parallel systems were moving at once. State-level forces activated by the governor, federal forces placed on alert by the Pentagon, and still no deployment. That raises an obvious question. If officials repeatedly say troops may never be sent, why announce readiness at all? The answer lies in how modern federal authority is signaled. Placing forces on standby is not just a military decision. It's a political message to local officials, to protesters, to federal agencies, and to international observers watching how domestic unrest is handled inside the U.S. It signals capacity without commitment, and historically, that signal has often been enough. The Insurrection Act itself has only been invoked a handful of times in modern history, most notably during the early 1990s. Even then, its use followed prolonged escalation and direct requests from state leadership. In Minnesota, no such request has been made. In fact, state and local leaders have pushed back strongly against the idea of federal troop involvement, accusing the administration of exaggerating isolated incidents to justify a show of force. Meanwhile, the Pentagon has remained careful, almost deliberately restrained, in its language. Officials repeatedly stress uncertainty. They emphasize preparation, not orders. They avoid timelines, destinations, or rules of engagement. That caution is not accidental, because once active duty troops are deployed domestically, even in limited roles such as protecting federal property, the political and legal consequences become much harder to control. And that's where the next layer of this story begins. Not on the streets of Minneapolis, but inside Washington itself. One of the quietest and most revealing details in this story is where the standby troops are coming from. The soldiers placed on alert belong to the U.S. Army's 11th Airborne Division, stationed at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska. On the surface, that might seem like a logistical footnote. It isn't. This division specializes in rapid deployment and cold weather operations. In other words, it is trained to move quickly into harsh environments where conditions are unpredictable, not just geographically, but operationally. That choice alone suggests that planners are thinking in terms of flexibility, not force. According to defense officials who spoke to major outlets, these units were placed on what the Army calls prepare to deploy status. That designation allows leadership to move troops if needed, but also allows them to stand down just as easily. And that balance is critical here. Because even without invoking the Insurrection Act, a U.S. president has limited authority to deploy active duty forces domestically for specific purposes, such as protecting federal property or personnel. That authority exists in a legal gray area most Americans never think about. And right now, it's being tested by circumstances rather than by orders. While federal agencies ramped up immigration enforcement across Minneapolis and St. Paul, local leaders accused them of aggressive tactics and insufficient coordination. Federal officials, in response, publicly defended their operations, stating that officers were carrying out lawful duties and facing interference. Those opposing narratives are now playing out simultaneously in courtrooms, press briefings, and social media, all while troops remain in limbo. A federal judge has already stepped in, issuing rulings that limit how immigration officers can interact with peaceful demonstrators. Those decisions added another layer of complexity, reinforcing that the situation is not simply about public order, but about legal boundaries. This is where tension builds, not through confrontation, but through overlap. Federal agencies operating under federal authority, state officials asserting state jurisdiction, courts defining what reasonable enforcement looks like in real time, and the military waiting deliberately on the edge of the frame. At the same time, reports indicate that thousands of federal agents from ICE and Border Patrol have already been deployed to the region. That reality changes the equation, because when active duty troops are discussed, they're not entering an empty space. They're entering an already crowded operational environment. That's why Pentagon officials have been careful to stress that no final decision has been made. Every statement includes qualifiers. Every briefing includes disclaimers. Every confirmation includes uncertainty. In strategic terms, this is restraint by design. But restraint doesn't mean disengagement. In Washington, lawmakers from both parties are closely monitoring how the administration navigates this moment. Some argue that preparing troops is a necessary safeguard in case unrest escalates. Others warn that even signaling military readiness risks inflaming tensions rather than calming them. And that debate isn't theoretical. Because once troops are deployed, even for limited support roles, it sets a precedent that's hard to undo. That's why Minnesota's National Guard has become such a critical piece of the puzzle. By mobilizing the Guard early, the state effectively signaled that it is capable of managing public safety internally. That matters legally, it matters politically, and it matters in how federal intervention is justified or avoided. Guard officials have emphasized that their mission is focused on preserving life, protecting property, and safeguarding the right to peaceful assembly. They've also gone out of their way to distinguish themselves visually, ensuring members are clearly identifiable and not confused with other agencies. Those details may seem small. They aren't. They're part of an effort to reduce friction, at a time when perception alone can escalate situations faster than facts. And yet, despite all of these precautions, one question keeps resurfacing. What would actually trigger a deployment? Officials haven't answered that directly. Instead, they've pointed to conditions, not events. Escalation, breakdown of local control, threats to federal personnel or infrastructure. Each of those terms is intentionally broad, which means the real decision point may come quietly, without a single defining moment. And that's exactly why this story hasn't ended. Because what's happening in Minnesota isn't just about protests, or immigration enforcement, or political rhetoric. It's about how modern power is exercised when multiple authorities collide, and how much restraint holds before preparation turns into action. For now, the soldiers remain on standby. No orders, no movement, no timeline. But the systems that would make deployment possible are already active, legally, logistically, and politically. And the most important development may not be whether troops are sent at all. It may be what this moment reveals about how close the United States is to redefining the line between federal readiness and domestic restraint. In the next video, we'll look at the law behind all of this, how the Insurrection Act actually works, why presidents hesitate to use it, and what past cases can tell us about what happens after the cameras stop rolling. Because the real story isn't the threat of action. It's the consequences of preparing for it.